The year is 1953 and the place is Waco, Texas. It is a Monday afternoon, the 11th of May, and the sky over this bustling central Texas city is a pale, hazy blue. The air is thick and still, heavy with the kind of humid warmth that makes you want to sit on a porch with a glass of sweet tea and wait for a breeze that never seems to come. In downtown Waco, the streets are alive with the ordinary rhythm of a workday. Office workers shuffle papers, shopkeepers arrange their window displays, and the clatter of typewriters and the jingle of cash registers mingle with the distant hum of traffic on the Brazos River Bridge. It is a peaceful, unremarkable scene. Nothing suggests that within the hour, the very fabric of this community will be torn apart, and the name Waco will be etched into the memory of the nation as the site of one of the deadliest tornadoes in American history. To understand what happened that day, you have to feel the weather. The morning had been warm, but by noon the temperature had climbed into the 80s. The humidity was oppressive, a sticky blanket that clung to your skin. Meteorology was not the precise science it is today. There were no Doppler radar systems, no satellite imagery, no 24-hour news channels to flash warnings across the screen. The only tools the forecasters had were barometers, thermometers, and the naked eye. And what the naked eye saw that afternoon was a sky that seemed to be brewing something sinister. To the west and southwest, a line of dark, rolling clouds began to build. They were not the fluffy white cumulus clouds of a summer afternoon. These were low, black, and churning like a pot of ink just beginning to boil. People who were outside noticed the change. The wind, which had been still, began to stir, but it was not a steady breeze. It came in gusts, then died, then gusted again, as if the air itself was gasping for breath. At the Waco Municipal Airport, just a few miles northwest of the city, the weather observer noted a falling barometer. The pressure was dropping rapidly, a classic sign of a violent storm approaching. But even with that knowledge, there was little that could be done. Tornado warnings, as we know them, did not exist. The word tornado was often avoided by broadcasters for fear of causing panic. Instead, they might say severe thunderstorm or dangerous winds. So when the dark clouds rolled over the city at about 4 in the afternoon, most people simply looked up and went about their business. They had seen storms before. This was Texas. Storms came and went, but this one was different. The tornado itself was not a thin, rope-like funnel of the kind you might see on a television screen today. It was a massive, wedge-shaped monster, nearly a mile wide at its base. It touched down just southwest of Waco, near the town of Belmead, and it began its march toward the heart of the city with a ferocity that left no doubt about its intentions. The first people to see it were farmers and rural residents. They described a rolling black cloud that seemed to be chewing up the earth itself. It was not silent. The sound, they said, was like 1,000 freight trains all bearing down at once. A deep, rumbling roar that vibrated through your chest and shook the ground beneath your feet. Some said it sounded like a giant waterfall or like the roar of an angry beast. It was a sound that made your blood run cold. The tornado entered the city limits along the southwestern edge, hitting the residential neighborhoods first. Houses were not built to withstand such force. They were wooden frames, brick facades, and stone foundations, but none of that mattered. The wind ripped roofs off like they were made of paper. Walls collapsed inward. Trees were uprooted and hurled through the air like spears. Cars were tossed into the air, spun around, and dropped on their roofs. People who were caught in the open had no chance. They were lifted off their feet and carried for blocks, or slammed into walls, or struck by flying debris. The debris itself became a deadly weapon. Shards of glass, splintered lumber, pieces of metal, and even whole bricks were turned into projectiles traveling at speeds that could pierce concrete. In just a few minutes, entire blocks of houses were reduced to piles of scattered rubble. And then the tornado reached downtown. Downtown Waco in 1953 was a proud and prosperous place. The skyline was dominated by the Amicable Building, a 12-story tower of limestone and brick that was the tallest building in the city. Nearby stood the Raleigh Hotel, the Alico Building, the Texas State Bank, and the Praetorian Building. These were not just structures. They were landmarks, symbols of Waco's growth and ambition. Along the streets, storefronts displayed the latest fashions, hardware, and groceries. The sidewalks were crowded with shoppers and office workers enjoying the late afternoon. And then, at about 4:20 p.m., the black cloud descended upon them. It hit the downtown district with a directness that was almost surgical. The tornado's path narrowed slightly as it moved into the denser part of the city, but its intensity only increased. The first building to feel the full force was the Dr. Pepper bottling plant. The plant was a 2-story brick structure, and the tornado struck it with such violence that the entire front wall was blown outward, collapsing onto the street. Inside, workers had only seconds to react. Some dove under desks or into corners. Others tried to run for the basement, but the stairwells were already collapsing. The air was filled with dust, broken glass, and the deafening roar. Those who survived later described a blinding whirlwind of debris, a dark tunnel of flying objects where you could not see your own hand in front of your face. From the Dr. Pepper plant, the tornado continued its path, veering slightly northeast. It hit the Texas State Bank building, a four-story structure of granite and marble. The bank's heavy stone facade was no match for the wind. The outer walls buckled and fell inward, crushing the interior. Next came the Praetorian Building, an elegant six-story office block. The tornado caught it from the side, ripping off the entire western wall. Office furniture, filing cabinets, and typewriters were sucked out of the building and scattered across the street. People who had been working at their desks were pulled into the open air, falling several stories to their deaths. The sound of breaking glass was constant, a sharp, crackling roar that mixed with the screams of the wounded and the dying. Perhaps the most photographed moment of the disaster was the collapse of the Amicable Building. It stood at the corner of 5th Street and Austin Avenue, a proud tower that had been built to withstand anything. And for a few seconds, it did. The tornado's winds hammered against its limestone walls, but the building held. Then the internal structure gave way. The floors on the upper levels began to pancake, one on top of another, as the supporting columns failed. The entire building seemed to settle like a giant sinking into the earth before the upper half simply slid off and crashed into the street. The impact was catastrophic. The debris pile reached 3 stories high, burying dozens of people who had been inside, as well as pedestrians who had been running for cover. Rescue workers would spend days digging through that pile, hoping to find survivors, but many they found only bodies. The tornado did not linger. It moved through the downtown core in less than 10 minutes, leaving behind a trail of destruction that was almost incomprehensible. When the roar finally faded and the wind died down, the survivors emerged from their shelters to find a world that had been turned upside down. The sky was still dark, but now it was filled with dust, smoke, and the smell of gas from broken pipes. The streets were littered with bricks, shattered glass, twisted metal, and the personal belongings of hundreds of people. Photographs, letters, shoes, a child's doll, all mixed together in a heap of ruin. The downtown district looked like a war zone. Buildings that had stood for decades were now piles of rubble. Others leaned precariously, their facades hanging loose like torn posters. The streetcar lines were down, and the overhead power cables lay tangled in loops on the pavement. In the immediate aftermath, the first priority was rescue. People who had been trapped in the rubble began to cry out for help. Neighbors, strangers, police officers, and firemen all rushed into the debris, clawing at bricks and lifting beams with their bare hands. They had no heavy equipment, no cranes, no bulldozers. They worked with shovels, crowbars, and sheer determination. The hospitals in Waco were quickly overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses who had been off duty came rushing in, many of them still in their street clothes. They set up triage centers in the lobbies and hallways, treating the wounded on stretchers, on floors, on any available surface. The most serious cases were loaded into ambulances and private cars and driven to other towns, to Temple, to Austin, to Dallas. The roads were clogged with traffic, but people moved aside for the emergency vehicles. As night fell, the full scale of the disaster became apparent. The official death toll would eventually reach 114 people, with over 500 injured. But in the immediate hours after the tornado, the numbers were uncertain. Rescue workers kept finding more bodies. Some had been thrown into trees. Others were found in basements, crushed by falling debris. Some were never identified, their bodies too badly mangled to be recognized. The search continued through the night, lit by car headlights and the flashlights of volunteers. It was a grim scene, a city in mourning, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and the sound of grief. But the story of the Waco tornado is not just a tale of destruction. It is also a story of resilience, of a community that refused to be broken. In the days and weeks that followed, the people of Waco and the surrounding towns rallied together. They brought food, water, and clothing. They opened their homes to those who had lost everything. The Red Cross set up shelters in churches and schools. The National Guard was called in to maintain order and to help with the cleanup. And slowly, painfully, the city began to rebuild. The tornado of 1953 changed Waco forever. It also changed the way America thought about tornadoes. The disaster prompted a push for better warning systems, for more accurate forecasting, and for public education about what to do when a tornado comes. The Weather Bureau, the predecessor of today's National Weather Service, began to develop a more organized approach to issuing warnings. The term tornado warning became part of the public vocabulary. And in a way, the sacrifice of those 114 people helped to save countless others in the decades that followed. This is the story of that day, the day the sky fell on Waco. We will take you through the minutes before the tornado struck, the moments when people realized that this was not just another storm. We will tell you about the survivors, the heroes, and the ones who did not make it. We will walk through the ruins and listen to the voices of those who lived through it. And we will remember. Because to forget would be to let that day die twice. To understand what it was like to be in Waco on that day, you have to listen to the voices of those who lived through it. Their memories are etched not just in their minds but in the very air of the city, in the way old-timers still glance skyward when the clouds darken in April. One of those voices belongs to Martha Jenkins, who was 23 years old and working as a secretary in the Praetorian building. She had stepped away from her desk for a moment to look out the window, watching the strange green-black clouds roll in from the southwest. She thought it was just another spring thunderstorm, the kind that rattled the windows and sent people scurrying for umbrellas. But then she saw the funnel. It was not the classic thin rope she had seen in pictures. This was a massive churning column wide enough to swallow entire city blocks, and it was moving with a speed that seemed impossible. She had seconds to react. She dropped to the floor, crawled under her desk, and covered her head with her arms. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, a deep, grinding roar that felt like it was coming from inside her own skull. The building shook violently and she heard a terrible cracking sound above her. Then the ceiling gave way. She was buried under a pile of plaster, lath, and debris. She lay there in the dark, unable to move, with dust filling her lungs. She could hear others screaming, but their voices were muffled, distant. She thought she was going to die. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she heard someone calling out, asking if anyone was alive. It was a fireman crawling through the wreckage. He found her, pulled her out, and carried her down a collapsed stairwell to the street. She was covered in cuts and bruises, but she could walk. She stood on the rubble-strewn sidewalk, looking up at the sky, which was now a pale gray, and she wept. Across the street at the Texas State Bank, a teller named Raymond Ortiz was in the vault when the tornado hit. He had been closing up for the day, counting the afternoon deposits when the lights flickered and went out. Then the whole building seemed to lift and twist. The massive steel vault door, normally a foot thick, was jammed shut by the shifting foundation. Raymond and 3 other employees were trapped inside for nearly 4 hours. They had no light, no air, and no way to signal for help. They could hear the sounds of rescue workers outside, but the vault was buried under tons of rubble. Finally, a rescue crew managed to cut through the wall with a torch, and they emerged into the fading light, blinking and disoriented. The bank building was gone, reduced to a heap of stone and twisted steel, but the vault had saved their lives. Not everyone was so fortunate. In the Amicable building, a young lawyer named Harold Pierce had been in a meeting on the 4th floor. He was standing near a window when the tornado struck. The window shattered and a piece of glass as long as a man's arm flew into his chest. He died instantly. His body was later found in the rubble, still clutching a legal document. His partner, who had been in the same room, survived by diving into a closet. He emerged to find Harold gone, the entire outer wall of the office ripped away, and the floor tilting at a dangerous angle. He crawled across the sagging floorboards and out onto a beam, then jumped to a pile of bricks below. He survived with a broken leg and a lifelong guilt for not being able to save his friend. The stories of survival and loss are countless, and each one is a thread in the fabric of that day. But the rescue efforts themselves are a testament to the human spirit. Within minutes of the tornado passing, the streets were filled with people digging. They used their hands, their fingernails, anything they could find. A man named Charlie Dobbs, a mechanic who had been working in a garage on the edge of downtown, grabbed a crowbar and ran toward the Amicable building. He worked for hours, pulling pieces of concrete and metal off of trapped victims. He was not a trained rescuer, but he had strength and determination. He pulled out a woman who was pinned under a steel beam, her legs crushed. He carried her to a makeshift ambulance, then went back for more. He worked until his hands were raw and bleeding, until the sun went down and the floodlights came on. He did not stop until the search was called off for the night. The city's emergency services were overwhelmed, but they adapted quickly. The fire department, which had lost several of its own men in the collapse of a firehouse, set up command posts at key intersections. The police chief, a stoic man named Walter Morrison, walked the streets with a bullhorn, directing volunteers and coordinating with the National Guard. He had lost his own home in the tornado, but he did not mention it. He simply kept working, his voice hoarse, his eyes red from dust and exhaustion. The Red Cross set up a temporary morgue in a furniture store where bodies were laid out on tables and covered with sheets. Families walked through, searching for loved ones. The scene was heart-wrenching. Some found who they were looking for and collapsed in grief. Others walked out in a daze, still searching. As the night wore on, the city of Waco became a city of ghosts. The streets were lit by the headlights of cars and the flickering glow of gas flares from broken pipelines. The air was thick with the smell of dust, smoke, and something else, something metallic and sweet, the smell of blood and death. The rescue workers moved in a slow, steady rhythm, lifting debris, listening for cries, and then moving on. They found a little girl, no more than 5 years old, sitting on a pile of bricks, clutching a stuffed rabbit. She was unharmed, but she could not speak. She just stared into the darkness. A fireman picked her up and carried her to a shelter. Her parents were later found in the rubble of the same building, dead. In the hospitals, the scene was equally chaotic. At Hillcrest Hospital, the emergency room was overflowing. Doctors performed surgeries in the hallways using flashlights when the power failed. Nurses worked without rest, their uniforms stained with blood. They triaged patients by severity, sending the most critical to the operating rooms and the less injured to waiting areas. Many of the wounded had deep cuts from shattered glass, broken bones, and head injuries. Some had been impaled by flying debris. One man had a 2x4 driven through his shoulder. Another had a piece of sheet metal wrapped around his leg like a bandage. The doctors did what they could, but they lost many. Outside the hospital, a line of cars stretched for blocks, carrying the injured from the downtown area. People drove with their headlights off to save their batteries, relying on the moonlight and the occasional flare. They honked horns and yelled for help. Volunteers directed traffic and carried stretchers. It was a scene of organized chaos, a city in crisis, but a city that refused to give up. The next morning, the sun rose on a landscape that was almost unrecognizable. The downtown skyline, once a proud collection of towers and spires, was now a jagged silhouette of broken walls and twisted frames. The streets were covered in a layer of debris that was several feet thick in places. Cars were overturned, streetcars were derailed, and the street itself was torn up in long gashes where the tornado had ripped up the pavement. The people of Waco emerged from their homes and shelters to take stock of the damage. They walked through the ruins in a daze, picking through the wreckage, searching for anything that could be salvaged. They found photographs, wedding rings, a child's shoe, a half-charred Bible. They found a sign from the Dr. Pepper plant, still intact, leaning against a pile of bricks. It would become a symbol of the city's resilience, a reminder that even in the worst destruction, something could survive. The cleanup began immediately. The city government declared a state of emergency, and the governor sent in additional National Guard troops. The federal government, through the newly created Federal Civil Defense Administration, provided funds and equipment. But the real work was done by the people themselves. They formed bucket brigades to clear the rubble, passing bricks and stones from hand to hand. They used horse-drawn carts and pickup trucks to haul away debris. They worked in the hot Texas sun, their faces covered with bandanas to keep out the dust. They did not complain, they just worked. One of the most remarkable stories of the recovery came from the African-American community of Waco, which had been hit hard by the tornado as well. The tornado had carved a path through the predominantly black neighborhood of East Waco, destroying dozens of homes. But the community came together, sharing what little they had. Churches opened their doors as shelters. Women cooked meals on outdoor fires. Men organized search parties to look for the missing. They did not wait for help to arrive. They helped themselves. And when white volunteers from other parts of the city came to help, they were welcomed without hesitation. For a brief time, the tornado erased the lines of race and class. Everyone was a survivor. Everyone was a neighbor. The funerals began a few days later, dozens of them all at once. The city's funeral homes were overwhelmed, and many families had to wait days for their loved ones to be prepared for burial. Some bodies were never claimed, unidentified souls who were buried in a mass grave at Oakwood Cemetery. A simple stone marker was later erected, reading, "Victims of the Waco Tornado, May 11, 1953. It stands there today, a quiet monument to the 114 people who died. But even as the city mourned, there was a sense that something positive could come from the tragedy. The tornado had exposed a dangerous lack of preparedness. The Weather Bureau at the time was reluctant to issue tornado warnings for fear of causing panic, but the Waco disaster changed that. The Bureau realized that the cost of not warning was far greater than the risk of a false alarm. In the years that followed, the Bureau developed a more aggressive approach, using radar and spotter networks to track severe storms. The first official tornado warning was issued in 1948 for Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, but it was not until after Waco that the system was expanded to cover the general public. The Waco tornado became a catalyst for change, a turning point in the history of meteorology. The rebuilding of Waco took years. The downtown area was eventually reconstructed, but it was never the same. The city's economy, once booming, took a long time to recover. Many businesses never reopened, the population stagnated, and yet the spirit of the people remained. They built a new city center with modern buildings designed to withstand future storms. They installed a network of warning sirens, the first of its kind in Texas. They educated their children about tornado safety, teaching them to go to the basement or an interior room when the sirens sounded. And they never forgot the day the sky fell. Today, if you walk through downtown Waco, you can still see traces of the tornado. Some buildings still bear the scars, the faded outlines of brickwork that was patched after the storm. There is a plaque on the side of the Alico building commemorating the event. And every year on May 11th, the city holds a remembrance ceremony at the Tornado Memorial in the middle of the square. Families who lost loved ones still attend. Older residents who remember the day still tell their stories to anyone who will listen. They tell them not to relive the horror but to keep the memory alive. Because in remembering, they honor the dead. And they remind the living that nature is not something to be taken lightly. It is a force that can change a city in an instant, a force that demands respect and preparation. But more than that, the story of the Waco tornado is a story of human endurance. It is the story of Martha Jenkins, who crawled out of the rubble and went on to live a long life, never forgetting the firemen who saved her. It is the story of Raymond Ortiz, who emerged from the vault to find his city in ruins, but who helped rebuild it brick by brick. It is the story of Charlie Dobbs, the mechanic who worked until his hands bled and who never considered himself a hero. It is the story of a community that faced the worst possible day and somehow found the strength to go on. The tornado of 1953 was not the end of Waco. It was a brutal interruption, a chapter of sorrow in a longer story of survival. And that story continues, written in the lives of the people who still call Waco home. They walk the same streets where the rubble once lay. They look up at the same sky that once turned black, and they remember, because to forget would be to let that day die twice. But there is something else that lingers from that day, something that cannot be seen in memorials or plaques. It is a quiet awareness, a collective memory that lives in the bones of the city. Ask anyone who lived through it or even their children and they will tell you that they have never looked at a spring thunderstorm the same way. When the clouds build high in the west and the air grows still and heavy, they listen, they watch. They know that beauty can turn to terror in the space of a breath, and they are grateful for every day that passes without the storm. That is the legacy of the Waco tornado, a legacy of caution, of remembrance, and of an unbreakable will to survive. And yet, for all that remembering, there is a part of the story that often goes untold, a part that lives not in the public ceremonies or the plaques on the walls, but in the quiet corners of private memory. It is the story of what happened in the hours and days after the sirens fell silent, when the last victims were pulled from the rubble and the cameras stopped rolling. It is the story of the people who were not on the front pages, but who carried the weight of the recovery on their shoulders. It is the story of the cooks and the cleaners, the nurses and the priests, the volunteers who showed up without being asked and worked without being thanked. One such person was a woman named Eleanor Patterson who lived on the outskirts of Waco in a small house with a large garden. When the tornado struck, she was canning tomatoes in her kitchen. She heard the roar, saw the sky turn black, and then everything went still. She waited, she prayed. When the all-clear finally came, she stepped outside and saw the dust cloud rising from downtown. Without a second thought, she grabbed a basket of tomatoes and a jar of water and started walking towards the city center. She walked for over an hour, stepping over fallen power lines and shattered glass until she reached the edge of the devastation. She found a makeshift triage center set up in a church basement, and she began feeding the injured. She worked through the night, dipping her cloth into the water to cool fevered foreheads, pressing tomatoes into the hands of children who had lost their homes. She did not know any of them, and they did not know her. But in that basement, under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, they became family. Eleanor stayed for 3 days. She never went home. She slept on a pew, ate what the Salvation Army brought, and kept on working. When the last of the injured had been transported to hospitals, she finally walked back to her house. The tomatoes she had left on the stove were burnt to a black crust. She did not care. She had done what needed to be done. That was the spirit of Waco in those days. Everyone did what they could. No one expected thanks, but not everyone who helped was a local. The tornado drew people from all over Texas and from places far beyond. Truck drivers arrived with loads of lumber and tarps. Doctors drove in from Dallas and Houston, bringing medicine and surgical supplies. A man named Harold Reeves came all the way from Kansas, bringing a truck full of blankets and a heart full of goodwill. He had survived the 1951 tornado that hit the small town of Udall, and he knew what the people of Waco were going through. He did not tell them his story. He just handed out blankets and listened. Sometimes that was the most important help of all. The Red Cross set up a relief center in the old train depot, a grand building that had survived the storm with only a few broken windows. It became a hub of activity, a place where survivors could get food, clothing, and emergency funds. The lines stretched around the block. People stood in the heat for hours waiting to be processed. Some were too dazed to speak. Others wept openly. The volunteers worked with quiet efficiency, handing out vouchers and directing people to temporary housing. They did not ask for identification. If you said you needed help, they believed you. And then there were the stories of kindness that seemed almost too perfect to be true. A young couple, newlyweds, had been married just a week before the tornado. Their apartment was destroyed and they lost everything except the clothes on their backs. A stranger, an elderly woman whose house was untouched, took them in. She gave them a room, fed them, and refused to take a single dollar. They stayed with her for 3 months until they could find a new place. The woman never told them her name. She just said, "Call me Auntie." Years later, the couple tried to find her, but she had moved away. They never got the chance to thank her. There were also stories of loss that defied easy explanation. A man named Chester Blaine had been at work in a hardware store when the tornado hit. He was killed instantly when the roof collapsed. His wife Mary was at home 5 blocks away. She survived, but barely. When the rescue workers found her, she was pinned under a beam, her leg broken, her face covered in blood. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital. When she was released, she went to the morgue to identify her husband. She did not cry. She just nodded, signed the paperwork, and walked out. She never remarried. She lived alone for the rest of her life in a small house on the outskirts of town. Every year on May 11th, she would place a single white rose on the memorial at Oakwood Cemetery. She did it until she died in 1989. The children of Waco also carried the memory with them. Some had been at school when the tornado struck. Their classrooms were destroyed, but most of the schools were empty because it was a Saturday. For the children who lost their homes, the days that followed were a blur of shelters, strange beds, and whispered conversations. They did not fully understand what had happened. They just knew that their world had been turned upside down. Many of them grew up with a deep and abiding fear of storms. They would cower in closets at the sound of thunder, even as adults. Some developed what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though it would be decades before that term entered the common vocabulary. One child, a boy named Jimmy Hargrove, was 7 years old when the tornado destroyed his house. He was trapped in the cellar with his mother and 2 sisters for 6 hours. The house above them was completely gone. When they finally crawled out, Jimmy saw a neighborhood that no longer existed. He saw a toy truck lying in the street, its wheels still spinning. He saw a dog wandering in circles looking for its owner. He saw a man sitting on a curb holding a photograph of his wife. Jimmy never forgot that day. He became a meteorologist, eventually working for the National Weather Service in Fort Worth. He always said that he wanted to make sure that no child ever had to live through what he lived through. And he helped develop the modern tornado warning system, a system that has saved thousands of lives. But the legacy of the Waco tornado was not just about better warnings. It was also about building codes. After the storm, engineers examined the wreckage and found that many of the buildings that collapsed had been poorly constructed. Some had used substandard materials. Others had been built without proper reinforcement. The city of Waco adopted new building codes requiring stronger foundations, better bracing, and more resistant materials. These codes were among the first in the nation to specifically address tornado resistance. Other cities took notice. Gradually, the standards spread across the country. Today, buildings in tornado-prone areas are built to much higher standards than they were in 1953, and much of that change can be traced back to the ruins of Waco. The tornado also changed the way that emergency management was done at the local level. Before the storm, Waco had a relatively small police and fire department, and there was no formal disaster plan. After the storm, the city created an Office of Emergency Management, which coordinated with the National Guard, the Red Cross, and other agencies. They developed evacuation routes, shelter locations, and communication protocols. They trained volunteers in disaster response. They held regular drills. It was a model that other cities and counties began to adopt. In a way, the Waco tornado helped create the modern framework for disaster response that we still use today. But not all the changes were institutional. There was a cultural shift as well. In the years after the tornado, the people of Waco became more cautious, more aware of the power of nature. They installed storm cellars in their homes, even in neighborhoods that had never been hit before. They joined the Skywarn program, a volunteer network of storm spotters that had been created by the National Weather Service. The spotters would drive out into the countryside when storms threatened, watching for tornadoes and reporting their locations. It was dangerous work, but the spotters did it willingly, knowing that their reports could save lives. The legacy of that day also lived on in the stories that were passed down from generation to generation. Grandparents told their grandchildren about the day the sky turned green. They described the sound of the freight train, the smell of the ozone, the feeling of the ground shaking beneath their feet. They told them about the people who helped, the strangers who became friends, the community that pulled together. And they taught them that survival was not just about luck. It was about preparation, about staying calm, about knowing what to do when the sirens sounded. There is a particular story that has been told so many times that it has become a kind of legend in Waco. It is the story of a man named Andrew Cole, who owned a small grocery store on the outskirts of downtown. When the tornado hit, Andrew was in the back room counting cash. He heard the roar, grabbed his wife, and pulled her into the meat locker. They huddled together as the store collapsed around them. When they emerged, they found that almost everything was gone except for a single jar of pickles that had remained untouched on a shelf. Andrew took that jar home and placed it on his mantle. He never opened it. He said it reminded him that even in the worst destruction, something could remain. That jar stayed in his family for decades. It was finally donated to the Texas collection at Baylor University, where it sits today in a display case, a humble artifact of a day that changed everything. And as the years passed, the city of Waco slowly healed. New businesses opened, new homes were built, new families moved in. The scars of the tornado faded, but they never disappeared entirely. There was a certain melancholy in the air, a sense that the city had been marked by something profound. The old downtown was never fully rebuilt. Many of the lots remained empty for years, filled with weeds and rubble. The city shifted its commercial center slightly, building a new shopping district further north. The old core became a quieter place, a place of memory. In the 1970s, a group of citizens formed the Waco Tornado Memorial Committee, which raised money to build a permanent memorial in the city square. The memorial was dedicated in 1981, a simple granite obelisk with the names of the 114 victims inscribed on its base. Every year on the anniversary, a ceremony is held there. The mayor speaks. The names are read aloud, a wreath is laid, and the people of Waco gather to remember. They bring their children and their children's children. They point to the names and tell the stories. They do not let the memory fade. But the story of the Waco tornado is not just a story of a single event. It is a story that connects to a larger tapestry of American history, a tapestry woven with threads of disaster and resilience. There were other tornadoes that year, other cities that were shattered. In 1953, a series of devastating tornadoes swept through the Midwest and the South, killing hundreds of people. The Worcester tornado in Massachusetts, the Flint Beecher tornado in Michigan, the Waco tornado in Texas. Each one left its mark. Each one prompted changes in the way we predict, warn, and respond to severe weather. And each one taught us something about ourselves. The Waco tornado taught us that a city can be destroyed in an instant, but it can also be rebuilt. It taught us that people are capable of extraordinary kindness in the face of tragedy. It taught us that the bonds of community are stronger than any storm. And it taught us that the human spirit, when tested, does not break. It bends, it groans, it weeps, but it does not break. There is a photograph that was taken the day after the tornado. It shows a young woman standing in the rubble, her dress torn, her face smudged with dirt. She is holding a small child in her arms. She is not crying. She is looking straight at the camera with an expression that is hard to describe. It is not defiance. It is not resignation. It is something in between. It is the look of someone who has seen the worst and decided to keep going. That look is the true legacy of the Waco tornado. It is the legacy that lives on in every storm drill, every warning siren, every community meeting about disaster preparedness. It lives in the children who learn the difference between a watch and a warning. It lives in the engineers who design safer buildings, the meteorologists who watch the radar, the volunteers who drive into the storm. It lives in the quiet moments when the sky darkens and the air grows still, and a parent takes a child by the hand and leads them to a place of safety. That is the legacy of the Waco tornado. It is a legacy of action, of memory, of love. And so the story continues, not as a tragedy, but as a testament. The city of Waco, Texas, stands today as living monument to the 114 who died. It stands as proof that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, hope can survive. It stands as a reminder that we are all connected, that we all depend on each other, and that the greatest force in the universe is not the wind or the fire or the storm, but the human heart. For those who were there, the day of the tornado is never far away. They carry it with them in the way they flinch at a sudden loud noise, in the way they watch the sky when the clouds roll in the way they hold their loved ones close. They have learned that life is fragile, that nothing is guaranteed, that the only thing we truly have is each other. That is a lesson that cannot be taught in any school, but it can be learned in an instant when the sky falls and the world changes forever. And so, as the years go by and the survivors grow older and the memories begin to fade, the people of Waco make a promise to themselves. They promise to remember. They promise to tell the story. They promise to honor the dead by living fully, by loving deeply, by preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. They promise that the Waco tornado will never be forgotten, because in forgetting, we lose not just the memory of a tragedy, but the memory of what it means to be human. The sun still rises over Waco, the Brazos still flows. The sirens are tested every Wednesday at noon. And every spring when the storms come, the people gather their children and their pets and their precious things and they go to their safe places. They wait, they listen. And they remember. They remember the day the sky fell and the day they rose again. They remember the day the sky fell and the day they rose again. But what does that memory mean to those who were not yet born, who never felt the ground shake or heard the freight train roar? For the children and grandchildren of survivors, the tornado is a ghost that haunts family gatherings, a shadow in old photographs, a story that begins with "your great-grandma used to say" and ends with a sigh. It is a part of their identity, a burden and a gift. One such descendant is a woman named Clara Benson, whose grandfather was a firefighter who pulled bodies from the rubble. Clara grew up hearing the story of that day, but it was not until she was in college that she truly understood its weight. She took a class on natural disasters, and when the professor mentioned the Waco tornado, Clara raised her hand and told the class about her grandfather. She described how he never spoke of the tornado at dinner, but she would sometimes find him standing in the backyard at night, staring at the sky. He died when she was 12, but she still remembers the way his hands trembled when he talked about the sound of the sirens. For Clara, the tornado is not just history. It is a wound that never fully healed, passed down through the blood, and she is not alone. There are dozens of families in Waco who carry that same wound. They gather at the memorial every year, but the gathering is not just about remembering the dead. It is about acknowledging the living, the ones who carry the scars. It is about saying, "We are still here, we are still standing." And in that act of remembrance, they find a strange kind of peace. But the memory of the tornado also changed the way the entire region thinks about weather. Before 1953, many Texans viewed tornadoes as a kind of natural nuisance, something that happened to other people in other places. After Waco, that attitude shifted. People began to take the warnings seriously. They began to demand better forecasting, better communication, better protection. The Waco tornado was a turning point in the history of meteorology, not just because of the destruction it caused, but because of the changes it inspired. In the years that followed, the United States Weather Bureau, which would later become the National Weather Service, invested heavily in radar technology. The first Doppler radar systems were tested in the 1960s, and by the 1970s they were being deployed across the country. These radars could detect the rotation within a storm, giving forecasters a crucial tool for identifying tornadoes before they touched down. But the Waco tornado also highlighted the need for better communication between meteorologists and the public. In 1953, there was no reliable system for getting warnings to people in the path of a storm. Radio and television broadcasts were often delayed, and many people did not hear the warnings until it was too late. After Waco, the Weather Bureau began working with local broadcasters to create a more effective warning system. They developed the concept of the tornado watch and tornado warning, which are still used today. They also established the Severe Local Storms Unit, which was dedicated to tracking and predicting severe weather. But perhaps the most profound change was in the way people thought about preparedness. Before Waco, storm cellars were common only in rural areas, where people had the space and the resources to build them. After Waco, cities across the tornado-prone regions began to reconsider their building codes. They required that schools, hospitals, and public buildings be constructed with reinforced concrete and steel. They encouraged homeowners to install safe rooms. They drilled children in tornado drills, teaching them to crouch in hallways and cover their heads. The Waco tornado became a case study in disaster response, studied by emergency managers and urban planners for decades. And yet, for all the progress, there is still a sense that nature cannot be fully controlled. No amount of radar, no building code, no warning system can eliminate the risk entirely. The tornado is a reminder that we are small, that we are vulnerable, that the world is not always kind. But it is also a reminder that we are resilient, that we can adapt, that we can learn. There is a story that is told in the halls of the National Weather Service office in Fort Worth about a meteorologist named Dr. Harold Brooks, who studied the Waco tornado for decades. He once said that the tornado was not just a tragedy but a teacher. It taught us that we cannot rely on luck. It taught us that preparation saves lives. It taught us that the most important thing we can do is to listen, to pay attention, to take the warnings seriously. And he would often add with a wry smile that the tornado also taught us that pickles can survive anything. That jar of pickles, now resting in a display case at Baylor University, has become a symbol of the Waco tornado. It is a strange symbol, perhaps, but fitting. It is a reminder that even in the midst of total destruction, something can be preserved, something can endure. It is a humble object, a simple glass jar with a metal lid, but it carries a weight that goes beyond its physical form. It is a piece of the story, a fragment of that day, a testament to the randomness of survival. And the story of the Waco tornado is still being written. Every year, new research emerges, new data is analyzed, new lessons are learned. In 2023, a team of meteorologists from Texas A&M University published a study that re-examined the path of the tornado using modern computer models. They found that the tornado was even stronger than previously believed, with winds reaching nearly 300 miles per hour in some areas. They also found that the tornado's path was influenced by the unique geography of the Brazos River Valley, which funneled the storm into the downtown area. The study was widely reported, and it sparked a new round of discussions about how to protect cities from tornadoes in the future. But the study also had an unexpected effect. It brought the Waco tornado back into the public consciousness, especially among younger people who had never heard the story. They began to ask questions, to dig through archives, to interview survivors. They created podcasts, YouTube videos, and social media posts about the tornado. They organized walking tour of the downtown area, pointing out the buildings that had been rebuilt and the lots that had been left empty. They helped to ensure that the memory of the tornado would not fade with the passing of the survivors. One of those young people is a high school student named Marcus Reyes, who in 2024 won a state history fair with a project on the Waco tornado. Marcus interviewed his great-grandmother, who was a teenager when the tornado hit. She told him about running through the streets with her sister looking for their parents. She told him about the bodies lined up on the lawns covered with sheets. She told him about the smell, a smell she said she could still recall if she concentrated. Marcus recorded the interview and transcribed it carefully. He included it in his project along with photographs from the Baylor archives. He titled his project The Day the Sky Fell, a family story of the Waco tornado. It won first place. Marcus said that he wanted to do the project because he felt that the story was not being told enough. He said that it was important to remember not just the tragedy but the people, the names. And so the story continues not as a legend but as a living, breathing history. It is a history that is carried in the memories of the old, in the questions of the young, in the research of the scholars, in the charts of the meteorologists. It is a history that is written in the buildings that were rebuilt, in the codes that were changed, in the sirens that sound every Wednesday at noon. It is a history that is written in the human heart, but there is one more story that must be told, a story that has not yet been mentioned. It is the story of a woman named Eleanor Vance, who was a nurse at the Hillcrest Hospital on the day of the tornado. When the tornado struck, the hospital was overwhelmed with casualties. Doctors worked around the clock, performing surgeries by flashlight. Nurses ran through the hallways, carrying supplies, comforting the wounded. Eleanor was assigned to the triage tent that had been set up in the parking lot. She worked for 36 hours without sleep, treating cuts, broken bones, and internal injuries. She held the hand of a dying man as he whispered his wife's name. She helped deliver a baby whose mother had been pulled from the rubble, a baby who was born healthy despite everything. Eleanor never forgot that day. She kept a journal, which she later donated to the Texas collection. In that journal she wrote, "I have seen the worst of what nature can do and the best of what humans can do. I have seen fear and courage, despair and hope all in the same moment. I have learned that the human body is fragile, but the human spirit is not. It is made of something stronger than bone and blood. It is made of love." Eleanor died in 2008 at the age of 96. At her funeral, her granddaughter read from the journal. She read the passage about the baby born in the rubble and about the dying man who whispered his wife's name. She read the passage about the human spirit being made of love. And when she finished, there was not a dry eye in the room. That is the true legacy of the Waco tornado. It is not just a legacy of destruction, but a legacy of love. Love for a community, love for strangers, love for life itself. It is the love that drove people to dig through the rubble with their bare hands. It is the love that drove people to open their homes to the homeless. It is the love that drove people to rebuild, to remember, to tell the story. It is the love that survives even when everything else is swept away. And so, as the sun sets over Waco and the Brazos River glows orange in the evening light, the people of this city know that they are part of something larger than themselves. They are part of a story that began on that terrible day in 1953, a story that will continue as long as there are people who remember, who care, who love. They are part of a story that teaches us that the greatest force in the universe is not the wind but the human heart. And that heart, though it may be battered and bruised, will never ever break. The sky is clear tonight, the air is still, the sirens are silent. But in the homes and hearts of Waco, the memory of the storm is never far away. It is a memory that teaches, that warns, that inspires. It is a memory that binds them together across generations, across time. It is a memory that will endure as long as there is someone to tell the story. And so the story ends not with a period but with an ellipsis, because the story of the Waco tornado is not over. It will never be over as long as the wind blows and the clouds gather and the people of this city look to the sky with a mixture of fear and hope. They remember. They remember the day the sky fell and the day they rose again, and they will never forget. The people of Waco have carried that memory in ways both large and small. Each year on the anniversary of the tornado, a small group gathers at the site of the old RT Dennis building where the plaque still stands. They do not advertise the gathering. There are no speeches, no news cameras. They simply stand in silence for a moment, heads bowed, remembering the 53 seconds that changed everything. Some of them are survivors, some are children of survivors, some are just citizens who feel the weight of history. They bring flowers sometimes or photographs. And they share quiet stories with one another, stories that have been passed down like heirlooms. A woman named Clara, who was only a child in 1953, still comes every year. She is now in her 80s. She walks with a cane, but she does not miss a single anniversary. She says that the tornado taught her to be grateful for every sunrise, to never take a single breath for granted. And when she leaves the gathering, she always stops at the Baylor Museum to look at the jar of pickles. She says it makes her smile because it reminds her that even the most fragile things can endure. But the memory is not only preserved in quiet ceremonies and museum displays. It is woven into the fabric of everyday life in Waco. Every time a child learns the tornado drill in school, crouching under a desk with hands over their head, they are learning a lesson that began in 1953. Every time a family checks their emergency kit or changes the battery in their weather radio, they are honoring the memory of those who had no warning. The tornado changed the way this city thinks about safety, about community, about the obligation to look out for one another. It taught them that survival is not a solitary act but a shared responsibility. That lesson is passed on, not through formal instruction alone, but through the simple, unspoken understanding that everyone in Waco is part of something bigger than themselves. And the memory extends beyond the city limits. The Waco tornado is studied in meteorology programs across the country as a cautionary tale. It is cited in textbooks as an example of the dangers of relying on outdated technology. It is used in training exercises for emergency responders, who practice triage and search and rescue techniques based on the lessons learned from the 1953 disaster. In that way, the tornado continues to save lives, decades after the last body was pulled from the rubble. It is a ghost that haunts the field of meteorology, a reminder that nature does not care about human schedules or human expectations. It can strike at any time with any force, and the only defense is preparation and vigilance. One of the most important legacies of the Waco tornado is the development of the modern tornado warning system. In the years following the disaster, the Weather Bureau, which was the predecessor of the National Weather Service, began to invest heavily in radar technology and storm spotter networks. The Waco tornado was the catalyst that pushed those efforts forward. It forced the government to recognize that the existing system was woefully inadequate. And so, slowly, step by step, the network of warnings and watches that we rely on today began to take shape. It is a network that has saved countless lives, from the plains of Oklahoma to the suburbs of Alabama. Every time a tornado siren wails, it is a sound that echoes back to Waco, a sound that was paid for with the lives of those who had no warning at all. But the legacy is not just about technology and infrastructure. It is about the human capacity for resilience, for hope, for love. In the years after the tornado, Waco rebuilt itself, not just as a city of brick and mortar, but as a city of spirit. The churches that had been destroyed were rebuilt, often larger and more beautiful than before. The schools that had been leveled were replaced with modern buildings. The businesses that had been wiped out reopened, some of them in the same locations with the same names. And the people who had lost everything found the strength to start over, not because they were naive about the future, but because they refused to let the wind define them. They refused to let fear govern their lives. They chose to live, to love, to laugh, to celebrate each day as a gift. There is a story that is not often told, a story about a young man named Thomas who lost his entire family in the tornado. He was only 18 at the time. He had no siblings, no parents, no aunts or uncles. He was utterly alone. He could have left Waco, could have gone anywhere, started a new life far from the memories. But he stayed. He stayed because he believed that his family would have wanted him to help rebuild the city that had been their home. He stayed because he felt that their spirits were still there, in the ruins, in the river, in the faces of his neighbors. Thomas became a carpenter. He helped reconstruct the First Methodist Church, the same church where he had been baptized. He built the pews with his own hands. And every Sunday, for the rest of his life, he sat in the third row, looking at the stained glass window that depicted the calm after the storm. He died in 2010 at the age of 75. His obituary in the Waco Tribune-Herald was just a few paragraphs long, but it included a line that summed up his life perfectly. It said he made a home out of the rubble and a family out of the community. That is the legacy of the Waco tornado. It is a legacy of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. It is a legacy of courage in the face of chaos, of hope in the midst of despair, of love that outlasts the wind. And it is a legacy that continues to grow with each passing year, with each new generation that learns the story and decides to carry it forward. So let us remember the names. Let us remember the faces. Let us remember the sound of the freight train as it roared through the streets. Let us remember the sight of the sky turning green, the smell of dust and gas, the weight of the silence after the storm. And let us also remember the jar of pickles sitting in its display case, a quiet testament to the strange and beautiful randomness of survival. Let us remember the nurses who worked through the night, the doctors who operated by flashlight, the strangers who dug with their bare hands. Let us remember the ones who died and the ones who lived. Let us remember the lessons they taught us, and let us honor them by being prepared, by being vigilant, by being kind. Because the story of the Waco tornado is not just a story about a disaster. It is a story about who we are as human beings. It is a story about our fragility and our strength, our fear and our courage, our capacity to endure and to rebuild. It is a story that reminds us that the wind may destroy our homes, but it cannot destroy our spirit. And as long as we keep telling the story, the spirit of Waco will never die. The sky is clear tonight, the air is still, the sirens are silent, but in the hearts of those who remember, the storm still rages and the hope still shines. And so the story goes on, whispered from one generation to the next, a promise and a prayer, a warning and a blessing. The story of the Waco tornado is a story that will never end because it is a story about us all.